Let us look at the solutions for the question paper 2016. Question 1 required us to calculate and display the volume. You were given the length, the width, and the height, and had to calculate the volume. So the length, width, and height were input. These were input using edit boxes, and they were converted, and the volume was calculated by taking the length, multiplying it by the width, and that is multiplied to the height. The volume was output to 2 decimal places, making use of float to string F, which allows you to use FF fixed, using 5 spaces in total and 2 spaces after the decimal point. So question 1 was quite a straightforward and easy question to answer. Let's look at question 1.2. In 1.2, you had to calculate the cost of water required to fill up the tank using the volume that was calculated in question 1.1. For the first 500 liters, the cost is 25 cents per liter. The next 300 liters, it's then 35 cents per liter, and the key being the next 300. So that would be from 501 up to 800 liters. The remaining liters is then charged at 45 cents per liter. How would we go about coding this? The volume was calculated in question 1.1, so this variable is a global variable. And if that volume is less than 500, then the cost is simply the volume times 0.5, which is what the question tells us. The first 500 liters are calculated at 25 cents per liter. The next 300, in other words, we are now looking at 501. The next 300 from 500 will take us up to 800. So we need to check if the volume is less than 800. If it was below 500, the first if statement would have been true and the cost would have been calculated. Anything above 500 but below 800 would then come into the second if else. So as the question indicated, the first 500 is at 25 cents. So here's your first 500. You had to have used a minimum of 500 to be in this particular case. That's charged at 25 cents. And then what's remaining is the volume minus the 500 that we took at 25 cents. The remainder is then charged at 35 cents. If I had to use an example, let's assume that we had 600 liters that was used. So from the 600 liters, the first 500 liters were charged at 25 cents, and then the remaining 100 liters is charged at 35 cents. So this was the first 500, and the remainder, which is your 600 minus 500, giving you the 100, being charged at 35 cents. The third category is if you got an amount over 800. So let's assume we have an amount of 900 liters. This is made up of the first 500, which is charged at 25 cents. Then the next 300 is charged at 35 cents. And then the remaining which is 900 minus 800, giving you 100, that is charged at 45 cents. So here we calculate the first 500 at 25 cents, the next 300 at 35 cents, and then the remainder, which is the total volume minus the 500 and the 300, which gives you 800, and that's multiplied at 45 cents per liter. And this is then displayed. It's using a currency and again 5 characters in total with 2 after the decimal place. So that answers question 1.2. In question 1.3, we are required to write code to convert the number of months entered into years and months. So in this case, we input the total number of months that's in a variable lifespan. So we're getting the total number of months that's being input. If we want to know how many months there are, we take the total, if we want to know the number of years there are in the total number of months, we take the number of months and div that by 12. Remember, div gives you integer division with no remainder. So if I had a total of 15 months and I had to say 15 div 12, I'll get 1 year out of that. And then to get the remainder, we use mod. So the total number of months, in this case, if it was 15, and I then say mod 12, 12 can go there 1 time, that's the div, remainder is 3. And that will give me the number of months that's left over. And thereafter, the number of years and the number of months is then displayed. Let's look at question 1.4. In question 1.4, you have to calculate and display the year, number, the annual income, and the annual balance of the setup cost. Let's try to understand this question a little better. So what happens here is you input the initial cost, for example, 500,000, and then you input the income during the first year. So in year 1, you had an income of 75,000, and you have to pay off 500,000. So 75,000 less 500,000 gives you a balance of 425,000. But each year, the income increases by 10%. So finding 10% of 75,000 now gives you 82,500. Subtracting that from your balance left over gives you 342,500. Again, your income increases by 10%, giving you 90,750. And then the balance decreases. So this process continues where your income increases by 10% and it decreases your balance until you reach a stage where your income exceeds the balance and you are now paid up. So how do we go about solving something like this? So we get the initial amount. So that's the initial amount that was input, and that was the initial income that is input for year 1. We have a variable called year, which is set to 1, starting off at 1. Once you have the initial cost and the income, we can now calculate the balance by subtracting initial cost minus income. And we then display the year, income, and the balance for the first year. We don't know how many times this repetition is going to take place, but we know the process should stop when the balance reaches a value that is less than 0. So a while loop is used. Since a while loop is conditional repetition, in this case, we will continue repeating a process until we have the balance that's no longer greater than 0, which will then stop this loop. So this is achieved in the following way. When we go into the loop, we have our year, which increments by 1. So from year 1, it would then become year 2. The income is increasing by 10%. The income is multiplied by 1.1. 1.1 increases a value by 10%. The 0.1 is the 10% of the income that's being increased. The traditional way would have been taking the income and adding 10% to that, which is income times 0. So this will work out the 10%. Once you get that value, you add it to the original amount, and that total is then returned back to income. So this entire thing is achieved by taking income and multiplying it by 1.1. Once you work out or increase the income by 10%, the balance is then updated. So we take the existing balance and subtract the income from that. There is an if check that's made here. I'll explain what this if check is doing once I reach the end of my loop. So this repetition process continues. As long as the balance is greater than 0, I increment the year, I increase the amount, the income amount by 10%, I decrease the balance, I then output. Eventually, I will get to a case where I've got the last installment that needs to be made. So in that case, the year will increase. The income also increases by 10%. The balance at this stage, after subtracting the balance would have decreased to being less than 0. Now, if the balance at this stage is less than 0 and the if check was not made, it means that the negative balance would then have been output. So we use an if check here to ensure that output is taking place. Output is taking place only when the balance is greater than 0. The else would mean that if the balance is less than 0, then it means that the value has been paid off. And that's where the message paid off appears. So the last time around, when you go back up and you test the balance now is less than 0. The condition fails and the loop then stops, bringing this entire process to an end. As I indicated in a previous video, whenever you're using a while loop, ensure that it follows 3 principles. ITC, I is initialize, T is test, that's what you're testing in your condition, and C means to change. Make sure that this principle applies. What are you testing in your condition? I was testing balance. So if you're testing balance, ensure that balance is initialized. It has a value. This is where balance is being initialized. It's getting a value before you can test it. And then, my apology, there's the condition here in the while loop. So balance is being tested in the while loop. This is where balance is being initialized. I'm giving it a value so that I can test it in the while loop. And then at this point, the balance is changing, which satisfies the third criteria. I is initialize, which is happening before the loop. T is test, that's what you are changing. And T is what you are testing. And C is change, which is inside the loop where the variable changes. Let's now look at question 1.5. In question 1.5, one of the activities is a dice game during which the visitor can win a swimming course or snorkeling course if the number of the two dice thrown are consecutive numbers. So we're looking for consecutive numbers on a dice. We need to generate two random numbers to simulate the throw of the dice. So a dice ranges from 1 to 6. We can use a random range. In order to use random range, you have to, in your user section, make sure you import the math class. And when you use a random range, it returns a single value in the range 1, and it's 1 less than the number stipulated. So as much as I've got 7, the value returned will be in the range from 1 up to 6. So this gives me my first number on the dice. That gives me my second number. How do I know if the numbers are consecutive? Consecutive numbers will have a difference of 1. So if I subtract the first value minus the second value, I'll either get a 1 or I could get a negative 1 if I take the smaller number and minus the bigger number. So I'm checking if dice 1 is the bigger minus dice 2, which is the smaller, that'll give me 1. Or the other way around, if dice 2 is the bigger and dice 1 is the smaller, that'll give me 1. And if they're consecutive, I'll get a value of 1, and then I enable these, the radio group, and I enable this button. And I'm also displaying the values of the dice each time that the button is pressed. If we look at, maybe at this stage, I could also explain a shorter way in which this could have been done. We could have worked out the absolute value. Absolute gives you, it makes any number into a positive. So if I had to say dice 1 minus dice 2, even if I'm subtracting the smaller minus the bigger, which will give me a negative, finding the absolute value will turn it into a positive. So this single condition could replace the two double conditions that I have here. Let's look at the next question, 1.5.2. In this question, you are required to use a dialog box to enter the visitor's 4-digit ticket number. You're required to extract the system date and then create a reference number in this format that is stipulated. Notice that these different parts are separated with a hash. So to get this particular code, we first input the 4-digit number using an input box as they had indicated. Then if the radio group index is 0, 0 means the first item was selected, which was swimming. If the first item was selected, you take the 4-digit number, add a hash to it. This gives you the system date. That's your system date. It's being converted from a date into a string because code is a string variable. Then it adds another hash, and then they required the code SW because it was swimming. Otherwise, it's the same thing except you needed the code SN for snorkeling. And that is how the code was meant to be developed. These were the answers to question 1 of the exam paper 2016. You could have solved it in a few in different ways and obtained the correct answer. I'm not saying that this is the only solutions you should have had. From my perspective, I thought these were the easiest ways of writing the answers. I hope this helps you.